Hello everyone, it's Elizabeth from the Smart Stitcher. In this week's video I'm showing you how to look at your sheepskin and to lay out your leather pattern pieces for your mitten, and then we're going to get everything cut out.
I've laid the fleece out on the floor, as the first thing I need to do before I cut anything is to check the sort of condition and quality of the fleece. I particularly want to make a note of any areas, and there's a little bit on the sides here that would go around the belly, that don't have much fleece on them, so I wouldn't want to be cutting my gloves out of there. As we are looking at the sort of skin at the moment, the head would be up at this end, the tail would be down at this end, the spine through the middle, and then the belly of the animal on either side, with the legs at each corner. So as once I've sort of had a look at the fleecy side, I also want to check the back of the fleece, because you don't want to have anywhere where there might be some holes or anywhere where it might be a little bit thinner. So just do a check, have a look, and sort of note any areas of concern. So on my fleece I can see that there is a slight hole over on this left hand side as I've turned it over, so I don't want to be including that when I make my gloves. The next thing I want to check is the direction of the pile, so I can know that when I put my gloves on, I want the glove to sort of slide in with the with the pile going with me. What I don't want is what I'm getting at the moment. So if I'm starting at the tail end and rubbing my hand like I'm putting my hand into the glove, I can feel that the pile is working against me. If I drag my hand the other way, I can feel that that is much smoother. So that means that when I put my pattern pieces on, I'm going to have to pay particular attention to make sure that as my hand goes in to the glove, my pattern pieces would sit to sort of reflect that smoothness of the pile. So I'm now starting to position my pattern pieces. I've actually written on my template because I'm going to need to reverse it. So I'm going to need to know which one's my right and which one's my left. So as we look at the view now, we are looking at the right hand. I've also got the thumb template in position. And what I've done before I've laid the pieces on is I have just done a sort of a final check by turning the fleece over, just to sort of make sure that I'm not sort of sat on any creases or any sort of slightly sort of finer pieces where perhaps it would give the glove an inconsistent texture. So I've just sort of checked all of that. The next thing now is for me to get my silver pen, and I'm going to start outlining the template. So I'm just going to go round that thumb section. I want to make sure that I'm nice and close in. Always worth just having a quick check just to make sure that your pen is working, and you want to get quite close to the edge. I can see on my first line here something got caught on my pen. I wasn't as close as I should have been, so I just make sure that I'm going right the way around, and then I'm going to go and outline the glove and then outline the thumb template as well. So we're all drawn on. I can very clearly see my outlines. My templates have gone sort of across the body, much like they would if we were doing traditional glove making, but because I wanted the smoothness of the pile as I put my hand in, I've actually turned the fleece round so that I was starting with my head at nearest me, and then there's sort of working down the spine, so I know that when I put my hand in it's going to be nice and smooth. Where I have drawn on, because we're working with a pile, I did use the weights just to help keep everything nice and even. We're now going to cut that out, and we're going to cut just inside of the line that we have drawn, and that means that we won't then see the line on the finished piece. When it comes to cutting out the sheepskin, we don't want to end up with a really bobbly line because its seam is going to be on display. So you have a couple of options when it comes to cutting. You may find it helpful to use a ruler on some of the straighter edges and use a scalpel as well. Now you might find it easier, some people might find it easier just to use the scalpel along the straight line without the ruler. If you move the fleece too much, of course your line may become distorted, so you're going to have to just take extra care to make sure that that is in fact lined up. So if you are going to use the ruler, this is where having some weights can be helpful, because you can just weight either end once you're satisfied that the ruler is on a straight line, and then you are just going to very carefully draw the scalpel through the fleece, and that will give you a nice cut in a nice straight line. Now this is where it's always a good idea to have a little bit of a practice, so I've also drawn a curve on the bottom here just to sort of show you that it is also possible to use your scalpel with the curves too. You want to be keeping the blade of the scalpel so that it is, well, sort of it's vertical, so that it's not leaning to the left or the right. You want to go in, and this is where you'll feel the scalpel biting the leather, and you just want to delicately cut through. Try and avoid doing too many little cuts, because you want to drag your blade through in a nice straight line, obviously always working with your fingers out of the way. I'm a little bit wonky there. The other option, of course, when you're cutting your leather is if you wish to use your fabric, not your fabric shears, your leather scissors. Of course, don't use fabric scissors, because everybody in the house who uses them you'll be in trouble. So we're going to just sort of cut in so I can follow the line. Now what I have to be careful of when using scissors is that the blade doesn't close completely, because what can happen when the blade closes is that you get a little sort of dink in the leather or the fabric that you're cutting out. So you want to be using the blade so that you are just smoothly following the shape. And there are some that say it's easier to have the excess on the left or the right, but you want to be cutting in a way that enables you to get a nice smooth shape. So for me, it might look like today I'm better off using the scissors on the curves, and then I can use my scalpel on the straight lines. If you are tapering into a curve, obviously just take a little bit of time to get a nice smooth taper as you cut in. So the next step then is to get all of our pieces cut out along the inside, just a fraction on the inside of that silver line that we've drawn. Another tip when cutting out is it might be slightly easier to rough cut around the edges, giving them a slight margin so you're not up against the line, just so you've got all of the pieces out of the larger piece of leather, and then you can come back and cut in. Some of you may find that helpful, but that's another tip. So rough cut and then come back in and do your fine cut. So I've used a combination of cutting on my gloves. I've used a ruler on the straight edges, and I'm now coming back into some of my curves and using the scissors. So when you are cutting, and when I talk about sort of not allowing the blade to close, you want to sort of open quite wide, and then you're very gently following that line of the curve, and then before the scissors get a chance to close, I'm opening them again, and I'm moving on and just making sure that I'm making as smooth a cut as possible. It can be really tempting to try and sort of hurry. Don't do that, or to sort of chomp away. Try and always keep a nice sort of smooth, even sort of cut. Now you may notice, and there's a few bits on mine I can see, that I might just come back in and just even up the cut a little bit more if it's slightly uneven. You can of course use a combination of the two. Sometimes it's easier to get somewhere with a scalpel, like into these sort of really sharp points, but you know, just take your time, don't rush it, and aim for everything to be smooth. Working with this kind of sheepskin, it does get quite hairy. We've got a little bit more to do yet before we can sort of have a good old sweep up. The last thing to do is to actually just cut out the thumb hole. Now you can, with your scalpel, you can just draw it down the hole, making sure that you stop before the end, and then you can cut in and then cut the shape out. If you wanted to, again, you could go around and use a scalpel on that. I found it quite handy just using a combination of scissors and scalpel on as I've cut everything else out, so it's worked quite well. So the last thing to do then is to cut out the thumb holes, and then we can have a good sweep up. Another tip when it comes to actually cutting out the thumb hole, if you are using scissors or a scalpel really, you can cut lots of little lines so that it's easier to get into your thumb hole. I find it quite useful sometimes if I am cutting to almost start to taper my cutting line in. So I will probably start cutting here, but I'll head towards the line and gradually then pick up that smooth shape. So I taper that in. Now we've got everything cut out, we need to remove some of the bulk from around the seam line. So we're going to be cutting off a little bit of the fur. The only edge that we're not going to cut is the bottom of the glove, because that isn't going to be stitched. But all the other edges, so coming up the sides, around the tips of the fingers, down to where they meet on the index finger, will be cut. Around the thumb hole will be cut. And then on both the thumb pieces, we will be trimming some of this fur off all the way around, otherwise we're going to be fighting with it a little bit when we stitch. So how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to take our scissors and almost finding the easiest way for you to see it. So it might be easier to see with the right side looking at you and then the inside of the glove facing the other way. It might be easier to see it from this side depending on how you angle yourself. Personally, I prefer looking at it from this way, because what I want to do is to work my way along the glove, and I'm holding my scissors at a almost like a 45-degree angle to my edge, so that I can just trim off the very edge of the fleece. And that just helps us to it gives us an angle to our edge, so that when we actually sew, we're not going to get caught up with lots and lots of fleece. So it's something that just removes a little bit of the bulk. We will give the gloves a final trim after we've made them, but just now going round all of those edges is going to be quite important to help us with the next stage. So I'm finding that I'm using a combination of both methods. When it's a straight edge, I find it easier to cut from looking from at the right side of the glove, but as soon as I hit a curve, I'm actually finding it much easier to go in. Now don't be afraid to really press the scissors down into the pile so that you can remove some of that fleece. So just work your way around nice and slowly. This won't be seen on the finished glove because the fleece will obviously be on the inside, but sometimes because of the pile you've got to press down a little bit more than you might think in order to give that edge a little bit more less bulk rather when we come to sew it. So you can start to see where I've come round, and then you can see just how hairy it looks on the bits that I've left to go. So don't be afraid of just pressing in, and we just want to remove that hairy bulk because we don't want that getting in the way of our stitching. So I've now got everything trimmed, and I've just gotten around, and we can see we've got a massive pile of fur to sort out. So I'm just going to take a moment to get everything cleaned up, because I am covered. So I would recommend at this point standing up and going outside and having a really good shake of everything and just cleaning up the work area, because then we're going to come back and we're going to sew the gloves.
Join me in the next video where we're going to be sewing our mittens together.